After two videos about Chinese politics, I'd like to turn to the economy, which I think is more complicated. I want to go straight to the point that I believe China is not heading towards a total crash, where all sectors in the country run out of steam. Like all major economies, the Chinese economy has room to pivot and refocus itself. Lately, China's economy is nothing short of dramatic. You have the property crisis, the zero COVID policy, the RMB devaluing against the dollar, the list goes on. A lot of people see this as a side effect of Xi Jinping getting more and more powerful, as he no longer needs to listen to his advisors. I think I addressed this concern in my last video, but I do agree that the quality of policymaking is at its lowest in recent years, probably because of the zero COVID policy becomes so stubborn that it draws too much attention and resources from other areas. As a mayor of a city, you cannot carry out any meaningful policy if you still have 5 COVID patients in your hospital. Come on, really? But overall, I think the Chinese economic policy has been quite successful in the past few decades and have found a few rule of thumbs that it can stick to in the long term. In Mao Zedong's era, there was an emphasis on equalization over efficiency. Nowadays, it's the opposite. In China, the importance of efficiency is out of the question, maybe emphasized a bit too much. In a lot of former Soviet member states, the older generation tend to feel nostalgic for the poor but equal society during the Soviet era. But I've rarely met any old people in China who feel the same way. Unlike those countries, the quality of life in China is much better in absolute terms. Regardless of age, people believe that the more work you do, the more you should get paid. I see the debate in China today is more about stability versus productivity. Certain social benefits, like healthcare and safety, could result in an efficient allocation of public resources. For example, in China, if you catch a fever, you can go directly to the best hospital in the city as a walk in patient. You pay a small fee in front, and you can see the best doctor in the hospital to check on your body. Sounds like a fairy tale in Western countries, right? The free walk in does guarantee people's right to see a doctor when they're ill. But do you really need a cardiologist to check on your blood pressure? Economic productivity and stability in China have both grown rapidly in the past 4 decades, but they don't grow at the same rate. The Chinese government has always put stability before productivity. The Chinese leaders realized early on that if you want stability, you need your people to see their wages increase and feel that they can now accomplish more in their work and life in much less time than before. If you have ever visited China, you may find that on the ground level, China is a very well managed country. And I'm not just talking about police stations. I recently saw a news that in neighborhoods with a majority of elderly people, the utility company is replacing the old meters with smart meters. If a person's home hasn't consumed any water, gas, or electricity for several days in a row, it will trigger an alarm, and the community service people will knock on the door and check on whether the resident is still alive. In terms of infrastructure, China is not just good at building new things, but it is also good at preventing food crises, energy shortages, flooding, etc. Providing 1.3 billion people with electricity and enough food is quite an achievement. And here comes the but. When you're successful at doing something, it's easy to fall into the mindset that if it always generates the result I want, then I'll just keep doing it and ignore the side effect. There's no better example of this inertia than the Chinese property market. For a long time, it actually served the purpose of stability and productivity simultaneously. People migrate to cities to seek better job opportunities. And you almost certainly need a long term job contract in order to apply for a home mortgage. You have probably seen headlines about how crazy the home prices are in major cities like Shenzhen and Beijing. The high price is now squeezing young people out of the market and the city, which is opposite to the original purpose of building more houses. It's about bringing people in, not driving them out. In the 17th and 18th century, France experienced a similar problem, but at a much smaller scale, and it was farmland rather than real estate. The side effect also took much longer to appear. At the time, the influx of money into land nearby Paris, Lyon, Dijon, and other cities caused French merchants to abandon commerce, and in favor of land, offices, and trappings of nobility. Meanwhile, in England, buying farmland was also popular, but the new landlords also had an incentive to bring in innovations in farming. The increase in food production allowed these landowners to invest in more profitable business like wool production, while the French were purely interested in the land itself. Once they purchased the land, the income from the land could be exempt from taxes, which was at the time much higher than that in England. In China, the absence of property tax has the same effect, which is property over speculation. People put all their money into purchasing houses, believing they can turn around and sell at a much higher price after a few years. As a result, in the past 20 years, both the supply and demand of new houses have been extremely high. It became a conventional wisdom that if you have money, you buy more houses. If you own a company, you better break into the real estate business. It's only after the recent defaults of real estate developers that people started to question this belief and realized how the home price has increased at the cost of the whole society. But before we blame the greedy real estate developers for all the economic problems in China, I want to step back a little and talk about how it started in the first place. After the Cultural Revolution, and when Deng Xiaoping came to power, China was back at square one in terms of economy. With no natural resources and valuable export, China's only option was to sell its cheap labor force, which was largely young. But if you look at the map, China is half the world away from major markets like the US and Europe. So why would a US firm build their factory in China instead of Mexico or India? Nowadays, people think it's because the Chinese workers are just far more agile and nimble than the workers in other countries. But in my observation, people from different countries are about the same in efficiency after proper training. To attract factories, the Chinese government needed to spend millions on roads and ports. But without any initial capital, how could China import the machineries to build these infrastructure on such a massive scale? This lack of initial investment is a real paradox which a lot of developing countries are still struggling with as we speak. What China did at the time was to sell lands to foreign investors at a very low price, and in returns, they need to build factories and hire Chinese workers. It was a win-win. This model of land in exchange for capital was actually borrowed from Hong Kong. It may sound like a piece of cake, but it was actually quite tricky, because the government needs to acquire large swaths of land in a relatively short period of time. Unlike Hong Kong, where almost 100% of the land, or the so called crown land, is owned by the Hong Kong government, land ownership in China is very much scattered among the locals. Therefore, land acquisition in China is never short of controversies and violence, even until this day. Shenzhen in Guangdong province became the role model of this type of development, thanks to its proximity to Hong Kong, but also to the relatively smooth land acquisition process, giving it a head start. Guess who was the governor of Guangdong province at the time? It was Xi Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's father. The 80s were a golden era for China. China quickly caught up with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, to become a major manufacturing hub. The government now has enough capital to fund new projects without relying on land sale. The land for capital model stoked the fire at the beginning of China's industrialization, but was largely set aside in the following decade. This model became relevant again only after the 1994 tax reform. The reform gave the central government a much bigger cut of the tax revenue. It was necessary at the time because the central government was nearly bankrupt and even had to borrow money from the provinces. The tax reform saved the central government, but now the local governments were scrambling to fill in the fiscal gap because now they earn much less revenue than before, while the spending on education, healthcare, housing remained mandatory. This time, the income from land sale is used not only as initial capital, but it finances the day to day operation of the whole government. In China, we have an awkward name for it called land finance. The local government connects a piece of land with water and electricity, sells the land in an auction to real estate developers, and then uses the money to pay for its bills. As the biggest landlord of the city, the local government is highly motivated to build better roads, better public transportation to boost the land's value, so they can earn more money on the next auction. As you can see, the snowball effect sets in quickly. The real estate companies were doing great. A typical manufacturing firm's average profit margin is about 3 to 4%, while at the same time, real estate development has a margin of 20 to 30%. Naturally, companies from all different fields rushed into the real estate boom. One example is Suning. They used to be an electronic retail chain like Best Buy in the US. At least that's what they were when I was little. A visit to Suning is always more desirable than grocery shopping with my parents. Around 2010, seeing the rise of e commerce in China, Suning launched its own e commerce platform as part of a transformation strategy. Another key component to that strategy is diversification. Sounds like a good idea, right? But what Suning really meant by diversification is to get into real estate. Suning was not alone in this game. There were numerous textile, manufacturing, or mining firms that shut down their factories and went all in to real estate. Kind of like Hong Kong after the 1990s, when everyone aspired to be landlords rather than scientists or engineers. Although the Chinese central government had warned against overborrowing in 2015, Suning was still betting on that home price in China will continue to rise. So instead of deleveraging, they put even more chips on the table. Finally, in 2021, Suning announced that they couldn't pay off their debt. They call it debt to equity swap, but that's just a better name for bankruptcy. At the height of the real estate frenzy in 2017, Suning lent $3 billion to Xu Jiayin. You probably never heard of Xu Jiayin, but by now you should know his company, Evergrande. Today, both Suning and Evergrande are seen as greedy short term speculators. But I think this dismissal is unfair. After all, they were just businessmen trying to make the most profit, legally. And compared to what the local governments learn from these land auctions, the real estate companies are just tiny fish in the ocean. So is the government to be blamed? Well, only if you take for granted the city parks, the shiny subways, the schools, and the hospitals. They were all financed, at least partially, by the revenue from land sale. What's more, the real estate sector has always been the most crucial stabilizer on the Chinese economy. There's no other industry that employs this many people and has such a deep effect on overall demand. Whenever China sees a downturn in overall demand, like in the 2008 financial crisis, the government would flood the market with credits for new constructions and home mortgages, creating an artificial prosperity in the real estate market. When people buy houses, they need to purchase appliances and hire workers to do furnishing. The workers now have money to buy new cell phones, watches, and then the whole economy is back on track. News media often pose the question of whether China is already in or will be in a full crisis. In my opinion, because the real estate industry has ironed out the wrinkles of the economy, you don't see the ups and downs that are typical for a growing economy. Instead of a waveform pattern with expansions and recessions, China's economy growth in the past 40 years is more of a clean, logarithmic curve. Underneath it is a constant but mild crisis. This sounds like wearing a mask on your scar and pretend nothing happens. But trust me, a lot of developing countries would dream of having such a mask at their disposal. If you compare China to the US, what the property market to China is what the railroads was to the United States in the 19th century. Railroad construction helped the US attract investment from Europe and accumulate wealth among shareholders. But the boom was built on borrowed money and clearly could not be sustained. In the year 1873 alone, about a quarter of the railroad companies in the US collapsed. But the 1873 crisis was right in the middle of an extraordinary industrial growth, so there were plenty of other manufacturing jobs. But in China's case, there's currently no good substitute for the real estate industry in terms of employment and economic ripple effect. The transition will be long and painful. Another thing that China differs from the 19th century US is that America was only dealing with a problem of inflation. The economy was overheating because of industrialization and immigration. But China is now dealing with both inflation and deflation. On the one hand, you have inflation in the housing market, a strong demand in construction materials like steel and concrete. But the consumer side, you can see a deflationary force. The aging population is the main factor, the high house price is another factor. In order to afford a house with good school and public transportation, people are willing to lower their demands for new cell phones and new cars. My parents often told me about how easy it is to find a coupon at a restaurant. A $50 meal would only cost like $30. The consumer is definitely happy. But if you're the restaurant owner, why would you sell something only for half the price if you know that people are willing to pay for the full price? In other words, apart from being a sales strategy to compete with other restaurants, there's a real concern that demand is not enough to justify higher prices. An economy where everything is on sale is not a healthy one. A healthy economy always have a moderate rate of inflation, where business owners can sell their products without discount, and people are even willing to pay more. The Chinese government started to take this issue seriously in 2015 when Liu He, the then vice premier, proposed the so called supply side reform. The supply side reform is a two-phase reform. The first phase is to stop companies in real estate and certain heavy industries from overproduction and overborrowing. It's like putting up a stop sign. The second phase is about unleashing real demand from consumers. For example, as a person who loves travel, I try to avoid some of the tourist hotspots in China simply because of their poor facilities. You may reach your destination on a 300 km per hour train, but then you may need to take a 2-hour drive on a bumpy road and live in a hotel room without toilet. The demand for traveling to those places is there, but the supply is not. The same goes for real estate. The local government have been creating on purpose a short supply of land, stimulating demand and keep the price up. However, people with real demand for housing now can hardly afford one. Land auction and real estate is a big part of the supply side reform. Policymakers in China do not like to make big announcements. They like to tackle a problem piece by piece. Sometimes the progress is not even noticeable. Last year, there was a major change in the land auction process that improves transparency of sales and pricing. Although it won't fix the supply issue at its root, I still think it's an important step. I know I talked a lot about the real estate sector in China. There are, of course, thousands of other sectors that are essential to the economy. But I'm just not an expert when it comes to automobile industry or oil refinery. I wish I am. I focus on the real estate sector because it helped explain the extraordinary growth of China in the past 40 years, and it also embodies the main problem of this growth. That is, an economy that's still overly dependent on government command and unfriendly to entrepreneurship of individuals. Don't get me wrong, I'm not in the laissez faire camp believing that government should keep their hands free from the economy. In the early days of America, there was a debate between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton on state power versus federal power. Jefferson wanted to give the states more power. They can import, export whatever they want. America should be a country free of government intervention. While Hamilton wanted to set up tax barriers so as to protect American factories from European competition. America should be about industry, technology, and military. At the end of the day, Hamilton won out, and America followed a Hamiltonian version of the country until this day. Hamilton did establish the first bank of the United States, but it was mainly to put the government's finances in order, and it actually closed down after only 20 years. During the 19th century, it was the industrialists and the bankers who were in charge of America. They organized mergers and acquisitions, deciding which companies should stay and which companies should go. There was no Department of Transportation. Cornelius Vanderbilt was the Department of Transportation. There was no Federal Reserve. Pierpont Morgan was the Federal Reserve. In fact, during the Panic of 1893, President Cleveland had to turn to Morgan to bail out the United States government from economic failure. My point is, a country can prosper even without an environment of competition. 19th century US is the opposite of market competition. However, a country cannot prosper without independent entrepreneurs who can make decisions on their own, instead of taking orders from the government. In China, there are a lot of people who advocate giving more freedom to the market economy. On the macro level, I totally agree with this. But on the practical level, I believe that without an independent class of entrepreneurs, the freer economy would soon be hijacked by individuals who already have a lot of power and money, essentially an oligarchy. Although China now sees the US more and more as an opponent, I think the nature of China's economic development is still a Hamiltonian one, meaning the government is going to make industrial policies subsidizing promising industries while clipping outdated industries like real estate. To be honest, I was truly happy when I saw the new airplane took off, and how Chinese EVs are welcomed in Europe. But with more successful stories like these, I think the Chinese government will be more confident in their own vision and capability, thinking that there's no value in grassroots initiatives and business ideas. Therefore, I'm not worried about an economic crisis, but I am worried about an entrepreneurship crisis. I think the government is not keen on fostering true individualism and entrepreneurship among the people. Now we're back at the stability versus productivity debate. An entrepreneur is someone who is willing to take risks and accept failures in order to achieve higher productivity. This is against the logic of Chinese policymaking, which is stability above all. A government that prefers stability will naturally pick the companies that have close ties with it when it comes to funding and subsidies. A recent example is Zhao Weiguo. Before he went missing, Zhao Weiguo was the chairman of Tsinghua Group, a state-owned semiconductor company that branched off from Tsinghua University, the best university in China. It goes without saying that Tsinghua Group is the government favorite child when it comes to semiconductor funding. Similar to Suning's diversification strategy, Zhao Weiguo used the money and went on a shopping spree of large and small semiconductor companies around the world. Tsinghua Group used to develop their own technology, but after Zhao Weiguo took over, Tsinghua Group simply buys high-end equipment from abroad, use other companies' technology, and put on their own logo on the package. It's a pure waste of money, but it made government officials happy. Tsinghua Group is now bankrupt, and Zhao Weiguo is charged with embezzlement. On the other end of the spectrum is Huawei. Today, Huawei is viewed as a tech company with extensive government and military ties. Well, it is not the whole story. When it first started, Datang was the favorite child in the telecom industry, and Huawei was the underdog. Ren Zhengfei, Huawei's founder, knew that he doesn't stand a chance to compete with Datang in the more profitable business like government procurement. So he made two decisions. One is to enter the overseas market early on, the other is to develop their own line of products. And they also started research in a technology that wasn't paid much attention to at the time. That technology is called WCDMA, or 3G as we call it now. In every industry, you will see a state-owned company like Tsinghua Group. Companies like Huawei are rare species in a country where government make all key decisions. They were not invited to the party. Instead, they were left on the sidelines. So true entrepreneurs will always be in an awkward position in China. On the one hand, they were almost all left out from state sponsorship or government subsidy. But once they are successful, they have to give credit to the government and the CCP, like all other companies. The government has also been very hesitant and ambivalent toward entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs sometimes feel that they were welcomed, but after only a few years, they were told to step over and let the government take control. That being said, there's no way to encourage entrepreneurship with a top down approach. When you start telling someone how to do things, you've already deprived him or her the initiative to think on his or her own. It should start from basic things like comparing the prices in a grocery store, and as a shop owner, making your own mind on which brand of apple you should stock. Then comes the bigger question like how big of a house you want to buy or how much you should contribute to your pension. Only when people are comfortable with evaluating costs and benefits, then they can evaluate abstract things like personal and social well being. Otherwise, no matter how well intended your policy is, it's going to be a vehicle for a small group of elite to profit from the state coffer. For a long period of time, investment in China is a no brainer. Besides real estate, certain corporate bonds are guaranteed by the state banks to have positive return. Can you imagine the US federal government promise to pay you back if you lose money on the bond market? The Chinese government needs to send a clear message that it's good to have faith in the government, but the government will not and cannot make decisions on people's behalf. In the end, the government is just one of the many forces in the market. Indeed, it's getting more and more difficult in China to find a clear cut between economy and politics. The economic reform in 1979 would not be possible without a political reform carried out in advance. Likewise, I think the prospect of fixing the entrepreneurship dilemma depends on how well the political reform goes.